Good afternoon. How's everybody? Are y'all as excited to
Doing
be here as I am?
doing good.
Great, great. All right.
It should be the week of the final countdown, right?
Yeah,
Most of you, is this your last week with students?
We're done already.
Okay, some of you are already in the green.
We're done tomorrow.
Next Friday.
Next
so
Friday? Oh, that's
the South Carolina people, what was it? Cherokee finished last week. Spartanburg's finishing this week. The local ones to us, Gardner Webb. North Carolina people don't finish for what, another week or so. Yeah, you could thank your legislators for that because they listen to the vacation lobby. Did I tell y'all that story when I got threatened with got death threats? So back in the mid '90s, I was high school principal in Charlotte, and I worked my way up to senior high chair. I was chair of the senior high principals. We were 10, 12s then, and that means you get a seat on the calendar committee, which is a big deal in Charlotte. And so I twisted up and leveraged everything I had and knew, and we were transitioning to the from AB day schedule to block in high school 4x4. And so I strong armed, and we started school back early, and we finished the first semester before Christmas, and it was heaven. We loved it, but that meant we had to go to school in August. The vacation lobby they tried to put a hit out on me. You know that beach rentals double June, July, and August. The rates double. Now, that's not. I mean, if it's $800 a week, it's 1,600. If it's 16, it's 32. And the vacation lobby just pitched a fit. That the largest at that time, the largest district in the state would do that. They were afraid that other districts would. Oh, they hired lobbyists. They did everything they could do except assassinate me. So that we did it for 1 year, and that was the end. And they said we'll never do that again. I said, well, I don't need to be on the calendar committee. But yep. Now I was among teachers and principals and parents in CMS. I was the most popular man in town among the vacation lobby and all the politicians. Um, I was on their dartboards. So, but you know, there's a movement afoot again to break away and break state law. I don't know what they'll do to punish those people, but there's a movement afoot again in North Carolina to start school back in early August to try to finish first semester before Christmas. But I don't know if they'll do it or not. But a lot of districts are threatening that they're going to do that, and they publish schedules. But state's trying to get them back in line. So yeah, we don't need to be in the business of going to school after Memorial Day. That's fool's errand. And so, but you know, that's what we're doing. Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm so excited that tonight we've got Dr. Sane, who is no doubt an EC specialist with us tonight, and he's got a presentation. But prior to him tonight, I've got our normal housekeeping, so I'll share my screen and we'll look at our weekly schedule. And I'll recognize, let's see. Better get back on this side of the fence here. We're at week 3, Zoom session 3, EC. I've got all these things that we're going to be doing tonight. I didn't open this one. I'll go ahead and open it now. I'm not going to sit and read it to you, but I'll reference it in a few minutes. Let me go ahead and open it up. And then there it is. I've already got our weekly schedule. So we're in week 3. So last week you were to do interview your principal and your human resources department about how hiring works in your district. Now, we talked about this last week, and I'm going to reiterate. The steps are the same. When Dr. Sane went over this last week, the steps are the same in every district, but who does them varies not only from district to district, but from school to school. So you got to know what your responsibility is as principal in that particular district. You got to know I'm the one that advertises, or I'm the one that vets, or I'm the one that gets involved with drug tests, or or background check, I call references or I don't. Everybody's got to know what their part in the plan is, because the due process doesn't change. The substantive due process, what you're supposed to do, the 15 things by law that you have to check off, that doesn't change. The procedure is what changes. Who does these things? Got to remember that. And so the person who was the star of the week on that one is Connie. So Connie's with us tonight. She did a great job on that one, outlined it very well. So she is the star of the week on that one. This coming week, we're going to talk. You're going to be looking at intervention in EC. Now, please let me make sure that you know. I want to. I'm gonna stop my share. I can see who's on. If something goes wrong with your EC, which happens from time to time, head count, evals, reevals get out of whack. Don't do a manifestation when you should have. You didn't count. Change of placements like you should have. Change of placement is really easy to understand. I'll be graphic. It's butt and seat. If the kid's butt's in a different seat, that's a change of placement. Well, he was in the room next. I don't care if he was in the room next door. Out of school suspensions count. In school suspensions count. Detentions count. Bus suspension. Moving them, bouncing, that bouncing thing you do in PBIS from one room to all those things. If his butt's not in his normal seat, his or her butt in the normal seat, that's a change in placement. That counts against your 10 days for manifestation. Now, if you make some of those mistakes, especially on head count and reevals, usually there's a buffer as principal. You've got a compliance technician in the big district, CT, or you've got an EC chair. But here's what you got to know. If you make a mistake in intervention, those kids get the same rights and privileges as if they were already in the EC program. Let me say that again. When a kid is referred for intervention, I don't care what you call it in your school, care team, care bears, support, helping hands, I don't care. What you call it, the state, North and South Carolina recognize those as SBCs. What's an SBC? School-based committee. That means principal's responsible. So if it goes bad, there is no buffer. We say, well, but the EC teacher was on that team. Yeah, they're just there for reference. They're just there as a resource person. They hold no responsibility. If you make a mistake, you own it. So you got to understand that you got to get intervention right, because there is no buffer. There is no door between you and the wolf. The wolf's going to get you, because intervention is a school-based committee, SBC. You got to understand that. So you got to find out at your school. Your task this week is to find out what in the world is this intervention. What are they supposed to get at our school, and who provides it? That's your job this week. Okay, so that's pretty simple. You got to understand intervention. Just like with EC, the big thing with EC is, and Dr. Sam talked about this. Don't just grab people off the hallway. You violate FERPA if you do. Make sure that if you don't have a regular ed teacher that teaches the kid, reschedule. He'll talk to you about that in a few minutes, because he's he's wizard at this stuff. But I'm just telling you, you've got some protections on EC. Not if you're, but only in terms of if something gets out of line in the paperwork. Now, if you do something to violate FERPA, or if you're the LEA rep as the assistant principal and you do something dumb like that, that'll come back to you. But all of intervention comes back to you. You got to understand that. So you need to talk to your people at your building about what they're supposed to get and who's supposed to deliver it. Our stars for the week on our evidence work. Let's see who our stars for the week. Kathleen and Shanika. Congratulations to them. They're our stars of the week. I love their work. I read all your stuff. I really enjoy reading about your schools. I enjoy what you do. Did a great job on those. So I'm appreciative of that. So good job for both of you. So those are our stars of the week. Now, I want to talk about case study 1. Now, case study 1's due next week. What are we going to do? So let me share my screen. So what you're going to do is everybody's got to upload their group presentation. If you don't, you won't get credit, folks. So right over here where it says case studies drop boxes, It says group one assignment. Don't think that the leader's going to put it there. Everybody's got to put your group assignment in and to get your credit. And then you put your case study one reflection in. Now you'll notice that this is an assignment. It's not a shared folder. I am the only one that can read that. You are talking directly to me. If your process didn't go good, if your leader was bad, or somebody was being a turd during your collaborative sessions, that's where you get to tell me those things, because I'm the only one that's eyes on me. I'm the only one that reads that. And you can talk about what you learned in the case. You can talk about the process of putting it together. That's your opportunity to speak directly to me. And so take the opportunity to do that. Now let's talk about the case itself. And so the case, of course, is will cheating strike Bobby out? All right. So right here's the case. Will cheating strike Bobby out? Let me pull up. And I apologize. I should have already had it up. Let me pull up. But I want to walk you in. All right. We talked about 115C 288, duties and responsibilities of the principal. Right here it is. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just do the shortcut one here. What's the very first duty and responsibility of the principal? To grade and classify pupils. So that would be you. So one of the mistakes that I see people make is, and I've already had folks turn some stuff in, this is not a principal problem. This is not a superintendent problem. Neither one of them has done anything wrong, nefarious, unethical, illegal, immoral. They're not incompetent. This is simply a teacher problem, period. End of story. Now, we're going to have some cases later where the principal's a nitwit or is incompetent or all of the above, but this is not that case. This is the most common problem that you're going to have in school in terms of grades. Number one, grade problems every day, something about grading. But this is the number one problem you're going to have in school when you have a teacher that goes rogue. That just, I'm fed up. I've had enough. I can't take this kid anymore. Now, before we get started, full disclosure, I'll go ahead and admit up front, Bobby's a turd and his family's probably a turd. They're all just turds. That's probably not a clinical term, but it's probably accurate. And the teacher's just fed up with this family and this kid. They have a sense of entitlement because of athletics and those things, but a lot of that stuff was just thrown in to throw you off the case. But this teacher has violated not only federal law, but state law. Let's track that quickly and share my screen. All right. What does federal law say about zero tolerance expulsions? You have to report these to the Office of Civil Rights, and it says zero tolerance expulsions are illegal. They violate the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. Also, the 69 ruling that kids get due process. The federal definition of expulsion is embedded in the first sentence above. An expulsion for federal purposes is removal from a child from his or her regular school for the remainder of the year or longer. That would be failing the kid for a year. Removals include both suspensions and assignment to alternative school. So even though you might say, but we're going to let him go to alternative school, we're going to let him go to summer school, which is alternative school, doesn't matter. You have still excluded him for 365 days. Overturning his brother's homework assignment. Let me say that again. You put him out of school for a whole year for turning in his brother's homework assignment. That is the very definition of arbitrary and capricious. So capricious is when you give too much punishment. Now, we've talked about this before. Me and Zach were out behind the building smoking. Now, I'm not a smoker, but I suspect smoking's bad for you. So Melissa comes along. She's the AP on duty. She comes along and catches me and Zach out behind the building smoking. She sends Zach back to class and says, "Don't you do that again." And she turns around, looks at me, pulls out her gun, and just shoots me. Graveyard dead, right on the spot. That is the definition of arbitrary and capricious. Arbitrary in that she punished me and not Zach, and capricious is I didn't read the code of conduct where she worked, but I'm pretty sure it didn't say that you could shoot me for smoking. Seems a little excessive. So what we would have to do in a case like this is this teacher illegally manipulated the state grading plan to count one homework assignment more than half the school grade for the whole year and failed him for the year. He got no due process. He could have brought a gun to school and got less punishment. In terms of teacher wrongdoing, the only thing that could be worse than this is if she physically or sexually abused this child. She did the most heinous thing. She took a whole year of this kid's life away, their educational experience, overturning his brother's homework. His brother's homework. So it's arbitrary, it's capricious, it doesn't fit within the code of conduct. Let's look at the code of conduct right quick. No, I went to the wrong place. I'm sorry. All right, so what it says, cheating, honor code violation, tier 1 response. All right, that's the first time tier 1 response. Page 9, what is tier 1 response? Well, it's real simple. The most that you could do for this kid, and if you wanted to punish him, you could just let him do the work at a lower grade. But if you wanted to make this a disciplinary infraction and punishment, the most you can do to a kid is 1 day of in-school suspension. 1 day of in-school suspension. He got put out of school for 365 days. In the eye of the federal government, that's a zero tolerance expulsion. 365. That's illegal by federal law. She manipulated the state grading scale in order to do that. You say, well, Dale, what do you mean? You do realize that districts just don't make up their own grading scale. The State Board of Education in the state that you reside determines gives guidelines. And so here's the one that for North Carolina, it's 9 pages long to understand it. So what I've done is I've made you a handy dandy primer here. I've got it right there, and it says grading policy simplified. And so here's what that 9 pages says. It says state testing, EOG or EOC testing in North Carolina, or state testing in South Carolina, can only count 20 to 30% of the student's final grade. This variation is to allow for the possibility of quarterly tests. If you have to do quarterlies, they count 10, and the end of grade or end of course counts 20. It count 30 in total. If you don't give quarterlies in your district, and they're allowed to do it or not do it, then the end of grade of end of course counts 30. Class assignments count up to 30% and tests teacher made. In-class assignments and projects count up to 20%. Out-of-class assignments or projects count up to 10% in total for the entire year, and homework can only count 10% for the entire year in mass. Now, whether you want to, potato, tomato, tomato, whether you want to say this was a project, doesn't matter. It was out of class, or if you call it homework. My definition, this was homework. But it doesn't matter. They can only count in mass for everyone they did for the whole year can only count 10%. This was one. He turned in his brother's homework assignment, one assignment, and failed for the year. So you got to understand the underpinnings of this. We say, but the principal asked the superintendent. Superintendent cannot by law tell the principal what to do, because again, by law, who grades and classifies pupils? That would be the superintendent. That would be the principal, not the superintendent. Cannot do that. There's been 1,000 times I want to tell a principal, do this or don't, but you just don't do that. It just can't be done. So this is not a case of the teacher didn't know. This is not a case of, the principal should. This is a teacher going rogue. Now, I'm going to call on Dr. Sane now, and I'm going to tell you that working in Charlotte, because of the high number of teacher turnovers, I did it twice a year. It's legally required, as you as a principal in North or South Carolina, that at the required work day, you have to cover the faculty handbook. If you had to sit through those days and you just thought, my behind was so asleep it was snoring after you had to sit there all day, well, that's a legal requirement. And part of that legal requirement is you have to cover the grading scale for your district. And again, I did it in August, and again, the years that I was principal in Charlotte, I did it again in January because I might have 8 or 10 new teachers that I didn't have back in August. But I was legally required to do that every year to cover that grading scale. There is no bootlegging the grading scale. The state sets it, the district, explains it and has scenarios, just like 9 pages of scenarios there to interpret. There should never be a question about a grade. But nowhere in there does it say we can take one homework assignment, make it count more than half of the yearly grade so that we can fail a kid. So understanding next week when we get through with all the presentations, and it takes a while, when we get through with all of them, I'm going to ask you what you're going to do about this teacher. That's going to be the question. That's the $64 question. Dr. Sane, how did you make sure your teachers were following the grading policy of the district and the state?
So before grades went out, they had to submit grades to me. We constantly reviewed and monitored grades. We did it during PLCs, but I'll tell you, I reviewed the grading policy with our staff once a month. We had a problem with the grading
Wow.
policy at the principals or
Oh,
the teachers. I had a lot of veteran teachers where, once upon a time that policy was a little bit different or they interpreted it differently. So we really had to in all 3 years, I'm thinking of one particular school, all 3 years I was there, we went over the grading policy, if not monthly, quarterly at a minimum. Just because it was important. And sometimes we get caught up in battles with students, and those battles turn into, actions that are not defendable by the school's administration. So and grading is usually where that starts. Or
yes.
I don't want to say that teachers retaliate, but you all know, you're all educators on this phone call. You've got kids who drive you absolutely insane. And sometimes grading becomes kind of that way we can level the playing field, but it never works. And it always ends in heartache on the teacher if those grading policies are not implemented.
It ends badly. When I did my second principalship, I changed counties. I changed districts, and I inherited a teacher. She had been teaching 15 years more than I had been alive. Let me say that again. She had been teaching 15 years more than I had been alive. This was my second principalship. After having been an AP, second principalship, she'd been teaching 15 years more than I'd been alive. We don't have that much anymore, those 40 and 50-year people that we used to have. But to Dr. Sane's point, the reason why to grade and classify is the very first law. It's the one that's the biggest one. It's the one you're going to be dealing with the most. Because it's the root of the most problems. And I hate to say it, because I'm old folks now. Remember, that was 40 years ago. I'm old folks now, but old folks are hard to get to change. And people who have been there a while, and I don't know, I hate to even say the word, but I think what we went through with COVID has shortened a lot of tempers and fuses. This is real, but trying to get older people who have wielded the sword forever and punished and rewarded with grades that kids may or may not have earned or deserved. That's a tough one. It really is. It's really a tough one. But high school, it's all about grades. Who's going to get to be a high school valedictorian, salutatorian? Who's going to get in the honor society? Who's going to get in this club? Who's going to get this college scholarship? Well, I'm going to tell you what. There are parents in high school that can calculate pi to the 17th digit in their sleep if it had to do with their child's GPA. I was in a conversation with a fellow today who's a high school English teacher, and he said that one of the biggest problems that they have is he's down in South Carolina, They have 3 different levels of weighting for different courses in terms of AP, IB, advanced, all that. And he said the problem is defending that to parents, that they don't have clear-cut differentiation between the curricula and the syllabus for those. That same English class has 3 versions that he teaches, and said parents just wear you out all the time. That they're trying to develop this summer, what they're trying to develop is a rationale to say this is why this one gets more quality points than that one. I'm telling you, grades, parents are on you night and day, both feet, even down to elementary now. Even down to elementary, they're over this, and it be better. You trust me. If it's not on the up and up, they know it immediately. They're calculating grades just like every day, just like teachers do. I'm telling you. And so something like this is obviously, this case is over the top, but I mean, this is the kind of stuff that this is not a principal problem. What are you going to do when you have a teacher who just won't stick to the standards, who just won't follow the policy, that's been there forever and think their name's on the deed, not just on the door? What are you going to do? Even if they're not old folks like me, what are you going to do when teachers are just at their wits end? Students are on their last nerve, parents are on their last nerve. What are you going to do then? And that's some of the conversations that we're going to have next week. All right, Dr. Sane, my time is up. I actually finished 3 minutes early. You don't tell it, because nobody will ever believe it. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sane now. I've got his presentation up, but I'm sure he can share his screen and do it. Again, he is an avowed expert. He travels all over the country doing intervention in EC. And we are honored to have him with us tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to him and learn something.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lamb. So before we begin, I just have a question. So how many of us here tonight are currently EC teachers? Okay.
Melissa, that
One.
it? We normally
I'm a school
have more.
psychologist.
Okay, school psychologist.
And
All right.
that's more than us. We'll turn it over to you, Kathleen. Let you teach next week.
Kathleen's in the fire a lot. And I respect your work, Kathleen. That's the role of a school psychologist.
Yeah.
You guys were talking about due dates and trying to catch that's not even a thing anymore right now. It's sad.
So the reason I asked that question is Connie is one. The reason I asked that question is to say this, is that what we're going to go over tonight, this is going to be very familiar to our EC teachers, our school psychologists. It's going to be very familiar to a lot of people who've sat in IEP meetings. But what I challenge you to do is that starting from this point forward, as you prepare yourself to be a school administrator, you've got to change your hat. You're no longer the teacher. You're the person overseeing all of the things that come into what is an IEP meeting and what is making sure an IEP is implemented with fidelity. Okay. So again, and for those of you who are not EC teachers, this is going to be very overwhelming. This is going to be, when you start managing the process, it's tough. You know how tough it is to manage your caseloads, and I'm sure that they are very large. You know how tough it is to cover when there are EC vacancies, which there are across the state. But now you have to take the role of, okay, I've got to make sure that within that coverage system, that within the fact that we're not staffed, that within the fact that we have multiple behaviors and students with IEPs and behaviors in our building, I've got to make sure that we are in compliance and make sure that our teachers are in compliance as well. So again, that's kind of the perspective that I'm going from tonight. Let me quickly share my screen. And please, again, at any time, stop. Again, I think Dr. Lamb will monitor the chat for me, because as you know, I'm not the best at it. But let's just go into a little bit of EC law. Let me get all of my people moved around here so I can actually. All right. That is not what I want to do. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. So again, basically tonight's topic is just EC law and what administrators should know when complying with EC policy. And again, kind of similar to HR, like we talked about last week, there are going to be some differences across districts, and and not necessarily with what the law says, but sometimes with the interpretation of policy, but also with the protocols and procedures of policy. So that's where it's going to differ from district to district a little bit. Again, I was in 3 districts over my career in public ed, and all 3 districts had different protocols and procedures for when things were due. I had some districts that actually required it sooner than what the actual law says. So again, the what you have to do is familiarize yourself with with each district's policies. But these are the things that you need to know. And again, I was a former EC teacher, so that was, and I'll tell you that was one of the hardest shifts that I did when I first became an assistant principal, is walking into an IEP meeting with the lens of an EC teacher, because that's not what you're there for. Yes, we're there to support that child, but at the end of the day, you're there to make sure that everything that goes on in that meeting is compliant with the law. Okay? Because EC court cases are a very real thing, and they will take up a majority of your time, and they will cost your district a lot of money. And so that's the idea of kind of to avoid this. I think Dr. Lamb's probably given you the speech, but a lot of the things that we talk about in this class are not pretty. But at the end of the day, they're designed to keep you protected and safe, so that you can have a successful career as a school administrator. So I went on a rabbit hole there, but the first thing is, if you don't have this book downloaded and printed in your room, EC teachers probably do, but as an administrator, you need this. It's the Policies Governing Services for Children with Disabilities in North Carolina. That's linked there if you don't have it. That became my Bible when I went into IEP meetings, because that book is about 250 pages, and you are expected to know it. Okay, and I know that sounds like a lofty task, but it is something that you should know from the first day you become an administrator. It is not something that can be learned over time as you get your feet wet as an administrator or an LEA for an IEP. You've got to know those policies. And so I'm going to start with this slide. Not knowing is never the answer. Not knowing will get you fired. It's simply put. So this process requires an administrator to ensure the IEP team is doing what is in the best interest of the student, but most importantly, complying with EC policy and EC law. Okay. So let's start with the basics. What is FAPE? And again, kind of how I've designed this presentation is that you'll have access to it on Blackboard, but once you print out that Policies Governing EC Children book, I've kind of aligned where this is listed in the book, just so, because again, I'm giving you a brief overview of that 250-page document. These are just the things you must know on day one of being an administrator. And so first of all, free and appropriate public education. It must be available to all children between the ages of 3 and 21, including children with disabilities who have been suspended or expelled from school. So FAPE must be made available as students transition from grade to grade, and it must be available to children who are incarcerated and determined eligible prior to their incarceration. Again, basically, we must give FAPE to every kid between 3 and 21. And that is your first, that's your first obligation as an assistant principal or as a principal, a school administrator, when you are specifically the LEA of your school. So then let's move quickly to Child Fund. And so the LEA must have, in effect, policies and procedures that locate children with disabilities from ages 3 to 21. Each district has a specific way that they go through this process. So that's where I'm talking about. There's some district specific things. There's ways that we must advertise that we have Child Fund and that we do those things in schools. So each district has a little bit of a different way that you might be responsible for advertising that in your building. But again, all children ages 3 through 21 with disabilities, including homeless, including wards of state, they must be identified, located, and evaluated. Okay. So then, in the world of education, we love acronyms, and those EC teachers on this call know that EC loves acronyms even more. So the next one is LRE, or least restrictive environment. This one is where, as an LEA of an IEP meeting, as an administrator in an IEP meeting, this is where you've got to be paying attention and making sure that we are providing the least restrictive environment for the student's academic needs, academic and behavioral needs, but we are not letting behavior drive placement. Okay. One of the things that can get districts in trouble, schools in trouble a lot, is that we put a student in a placement just because we don't want to deal with the behavior. And it's not driven by other factors. So you just got to be very, that's why when you're in these IEP meetings, you've got to be aware of what's going on. You can't be distracted. I bet if we raised hands, I'm not going to ask you to, but you've probably been in, those of you on this call with who are EC teachers and have been a part of IEP meeting or led IEP meetings where your assistant principal or principal was doing something else, like checking emails on their cell phones, or any teachers on the call who've been a part of an IEP team meeting where you yourself might have been distracted, maybe on a cell phone typing. So as a leader or as an LEA, you must make sure that everyone is paying attention. When people stop paying attention, mistakes are made. And on the flip side of that, when you think about the roles and responsibilities of an EC teacher, how beneficial would it be for an LEA of an IEP meeting to support the EC teacher when there may be things that EC teacher has overlooked? When I was an EC teacher, there were countless times that I overlooked something on an IEP. I maybe had something misdocumented that I had. Luckily, I had some pretty good experiences with some great APs where they would come in and kind of say, hey, Josh, go back and look at that. I don't think that's worded correctly. So again, it's so important to be present. But least restrictive environment means to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with students who are non-disabled or their non-disabled peers. Removal of those children from the regular education environment only if the severity of the disability cannot be achieved in the regular education classroom. Again, it has to be, when we talk about self-containing students, that's a big debate in public education. I know in every district that I was in, we went through phases where we tried to dissolve self-contained rooms. We added self-contained rooms or more restrictive environments for students. But again, it all has to be what is on the best interest of the kid and their needs, and not what makes teachers' lives better. Okay, that's hard to hear as we're all sitting here as educators. And I know that there are some students with disabilities that deep down educators believe should be removed from the classroom. But if we removed every student that teachers wanted to be removed from the classrooms, we would have a public education system built off of self-contained classrooms. It would be kind of reversed. And those least restrictive environment rules and policies are in place to ensure that we provide appropriate expectation for our students with disabilities in the classroom. And at the end of the day, in the regular education classroom is where they're going to get the best education. Again, with the exception of those students who just have needs that are too severe and cannot be, that instruction cannot be provided in the regular education classroom. So continuum of alternative placements. So each LEA must ensure that there is this continuum of placements made available. And what that continuum of placement means is that there should be regular education classrooms, there should be special classrooms, there could be special schools, home instruction, or instruction in hospitals and institutions. Okay, so the number one question that I get when I go and support districts, when I go and support principals with EC law is, well, our district doesn't have a special school, so we can't offer that. The answer to that is you never say that. Okay, you try to, and y'all, there's some, I know some of you are smiling, but this happens all the time. If you're in a district where there isn't a special school, you could have an administrator step up and say, I'm sorry, we can't consider that because we don't have a special school here. Well, if that's what's in the best interest of that student, then the district must provide some type of accommodation, whether it be in partnership with another district or they create a special school within their district. We must do what's in the best interest of the student, and you cannot say we don't have it, because at the end of the day, if you need it, you have to have it. Does that make sense to everyone? What I'm saying there? Just, if, and here's another thing. At any time during an assistant or during an IEP meeting, if you're an administrator and you don't know the answer, do not make it up. Stop the meeting. Okay, so for example, if there is a parent in the IEP meeting saying, a special school is what's in the best interest of my student. This is what I'm advocating for. You have a discussion about it, but you're unsure how to proceed because the district doesn't have a special school. Then best practice would be to table the meeting, get the appropriate answers, and come back to the drawing board, come back to the IEP team. But you want to know the number one reason why people don't table the meeting? Anybody want to shout out why we often don't want to stop the meeting or end it because we don't know the answer? Anyone want to?
Compliance timelines.
Yes.
Schedule.
Yes, the schedule. We're going to talk about the schedule in a second, but that's why it is so important to try and give yourself a buffer between those timelines, because we're not always guaranteed that the meetings are going to go successfully, and we're not always guaranteed that we can make all the best decisions in that one meeting. So sometimes it is difficult to get people in the meeting, and I truly understand that. But you also know your kids, and you also know your parents. And as an LEA and a school administrator, you're going to know your kids and you're going to know those parents really well who might need a little bit more time if we're specifically making IEP decisions. So just keep that in mind. We cannot say we don't have it, and we cannot say we can't table the meeting because of the deadline. And I have told principals before, I even told my assistant principals, if we were too close to a deadline and we didn't feel like tabling the meeting was an option, but we were talking about something that could get us sued, I would rather have a non-compliant deadline than go through a lawsuit. So just keep that in mind. If it's a situation where you need to table the meeting, table it. And listen, tabling a meeting can be 20 minutes while you step outside, call someone, get somebody into an IEP meeting that may know the answer to the question. So just don't say you don't know, and don't say we don't have that, especially if it's in the discussion of what's in the best interest of the kid. Anything you want to add there, Dr. Lamb?
I had a situation. Oh, Dr. Sane, do you need to plug your machine in? There's a big caution light down at the bottom.
Funny story. I left my charger in the airport, so this is one of those generic chargers. It's charging. It's just
okay. It just keeps telling us that. I had a situation where a kid needed homebound, and the district said we don't do homebound, and don't offer that. Well, that's what the team determined, and he did need homebound, and that kind of puts you in a pickle sometimes as the LEA rep. I was principal of the school, but I was the LEA rep because I didn't have an AP. We were transitioning in that district, and I had a shared one, but I was letting him stay at the junior high because they were transitioning to a middle school and they needed more help. And so I was doing the LEA rep as a principal. And I don't know, Dr. Sane may have a better, I don't really have a solution to that problem. When your district says we don't offer that, but your team says we do, there's the rub on that continuum of services. It just becomes a negotiation with your central office people, is all I know. And that's what I did. And I was able to finally wrangle enough to get him some homebound 2 hours a week, but it wasn't much.
The only solution that I've had, Dr. Lamb, to your point, that was successful is negotiating with central office during an IEP meeting. I made every effort to invite the people that were making those decisions to the IEP meeting, just because, it's by law, you can't say no. So,
yeah.
And I know money and finance is an issue, but if there is a conflict with your district, then that becomes an issue where the district needs to have a presence in the IEP meeting to discuss why, because that's above, in my opinion, that's above a principal's pay grade.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
All right. Placement decisions. So when we've talked about placements, we've talked about all the continuum of placements that we should have. So who makes those placement decisions? It's made by the IEP team. It is never made in isolation. It should never be predetermined. It should conform to all least restrictive environment requirements. And then obviously the child's placement is reviewed annually. As you know, a student with an IEP must have their IEP reviewed annually, and then it should be reevaluated every 3 years. Can be reevaluated more. We'll talk about that in just a second. But again, it should be reviewed annually. But again, please do not make decisions or single source decisions. One person can't make this decision. It must be a collective IEP team decision. Also, when you're going to run across educators when you're a principal who have been teaching EC a long time, and they may start cutting corners in IEP meetings, or they may go in and kind of eliminate discussion and just say, here's what we're going to do. And you have parents who you think, okay, that's great, we trust you. But then 2 days later, you get an email or from an advocate or from some type of agency saying that you did not allow decision, you didn't allow discussion. And at the end of the day, it's not the EC teacher who's going to get the full front of that process, so to speak. It's going to be the LEA who signed off that all these decisions were compliant. So just keep that in mind when we talk about placements. All right, so who's the IEP team? This is my favorite slide. This is where I'll get on my soapbox. The IEP team must include an LEA representative, and it should be in parentheses that is committed to the time the IEP lasts, the IEP meeting time lasts. They must be present. They must be active. They cannot be distracted. Okay. And so everybody on this call, when you guys become assistant principals and principals, you are going to be that LEA rep that is fully involved in the IEP meeting. Okay. There should be parents or guardians there. There should be other persons knowledgeable about the child. There should be persons knowledgeable about the meaning of evaluation data or any data that's discussed. And there should be persons knowledgeable about placement options. So let's talk about other persons knowledgeable about the child. Is that some random teacher that you grab in the hallway because you can't find a regular education teacher to be present in the meeting? The answer to that is no. It has to be somebody who knows the kid. And in school, who is the best person that knows the kid? It is the primary teacher in elementary, and it is both teachers in middle school if you tag team, or all the teachers, especially the reading and math teacher in middle school. High school, the same. It should be teachers it should be multiple teachers that manage or deal with the kid on a daily basis. Who sets the expectation of who attends IEP meetings is the school's leadership. An IEP teacher or EC teacher should be supported with that. So if you have a problem in a school where people don't want to come, people don't want to, you can't get teachers, that's a school culture problem. And that's really an administrator falling short on the expectations of the school. Administrators must ensure that there are people there. You'll notice there's some best practices there. I've highlighted them in bold just if you want to come back to this presentation. But basically, do not hold IEP meetings if key stakeholders cannot be present. So if the teacher can't be there, don't hold it. If someone is there or that needs to be there to interpret data cannot be there, do not hold the meeting. The best practices should be LEA representatives should always be present and involved in IEP team decisions. Here was my pet peeve as a principal, and then as a district leader supporting. I kind of shared the EC process with our EC director, and Kathleen, you might agree or disagree with this, but if we ever had an IEP situation where we needed a school psychologist there to interpret data, they must have been there. We required that school psychologists be there to help interpret data because they're the ones that can interpret that data the best. They're school psychologists for a reason. And so we need them there to support. One of the things that it's a mindset shift, but EC teachers are not the IEP team. EC teachers are not the person responsible for everything that goes on in that meeting. EC teachers are there to support the special education learning of the student. The IEP team collectively ensures what's in the best interest of that kid. And so if there is a school psychologist that's needed to interpret data, if there's a teacher that's needed to be there, for example, this happened all the time in middle schools. We had a student who might have had a math disability. Well, the IEP team invited the reading teacher. What does the reading teacher know about the student's math disability? So again, there's a lot of things that are into play, and it is sometimes impossible to schedule meetings where you get this collective IEP setting there. But I apologize, that's my doorbell. But you've got to make every effort possible to get the right people in the meetings at the right time. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. All right. So children in private schools. This is another one where over the years I've had a lot of assistant principals and principals tell parents of children in private schools, we don't do that, when in reality we must. So the LEA, where the private school is located, must locate, identify, and evaluate all children with disabilities who are enrolled by their parents in private schools. And there also should be homeschools as well. We've got, especially in a post-COVID world, you've got a huge uptick in homeschooling. So that's also, that's included in this. But private school parents can also request an evaluation. So the LEAs must treat child-find procedures for children in private schools as they would public school children. So with activities, with costs, with during that completion period, all of those things fall under the public schools, responsibility. There are all sorts of caveats, and we could spend a whole 2-hour session talking about children with private schools. But this is where I really want you to go back to your districts and learn specifically what the procedures and the protocols are for when you do have a parent request from a private school. I was in Lincoln County when I worked at the district office. We had a very different process for private schools than let's say Gaston County, which was our border, Catawba County. We all three were different. We were right there together. We have, we served a lot of the same kids in terms of demographics, but we had very different procedures. And I guarantee you, Dr. Lamb can confirm this, that CMS has a much different process and procedure, because again, a lot of things are dictated on how big the district is. But again, private schools, when we're talking about locating and child find, locating students with disabilities, that does fall under our responsibility to evaluate and to identify those kids. All right. So again, just this slide again, best practice there: be informed of your district's procedures and protocols regarding those students in private schools. One of the things on this one down there at the bottom, if a private school child has been designated to receive services, they must have a service plan that meets the requirement of an IEP, and it must be consistently reviewed and revised. So again, main point, go back to your districts, understand the policies and procedures there, because they do vary a little bit in each district. All right, parental consent. During an initial evaluation, so I'm just going to give you an example. An MTSS team says that the student is not responding to reading intervention. They're performing highly in math, or they're performing well in math. They suspect a learning disability. And so once that happens, the LEA provides notice and it must obtain informed consent from the parent before conducting the evaluation. This is for initials. You must have parent or guardian consent to conduct an initial evaluation. Parental consent for evaluation is not consent for services. So there's always a bit of confusion there, especially as some of our newer administrators who don't have a history in EC. But again, you must have parental consent to conduct the evaluation to determine if services are warranted. They're not the same thing. So there are a couple of exceptions. So consent is not warranted of children who are wards of the state or parents' rights have been removed by a judge. And LEAs can proceed without parental consent, but there are specific procedural safeguards that must be met. And here is what I would do. When you don't have parent consent, that is always a phone call to your district's EC office. Always get someone else on the phone to walk you through a process that you know is not necessarily in compliance. There's always caveats. There's always things that go on. There's always reasons why we might not get consent. My philosophy was you do everything in your power to get parental consent, but when you cannot, there are ways that you can kind of get through the process, so to speak. But again, you've got to make sure that your EC director or somebody at your central office's EC team is walking you through that process. Even after you've done this 15, 16 years as a school administrator, it is best practice to always have somebody else on your team as you're going through these kind of tricky situations. All right. Again, let's just a little bit more about parental consent. So the LEA is responsible for making FAPE available to a child with a disability, and you must obtain informed consent or make a reasonable effort to gain consent from the parent before those services can begin. Reasonable effort is up to interpretation, but most districts you'll find that reasonable effort should be multiple attempts. It shouldn't just be a phone call. I sat in a meeting once where they did not obtain a consent, and I asked the question, how many attempts have we made? A person of the IEP team said, oh, we called, their voicemail's been discontinued, so we can't get in touch with them. That will not hold up in any court of law. You must make every effort to obtain consent, whether it be house visits, emails, phone calls, whatever you got to do to get consent. You must make every effort to do so. Again, there are ways that you can still provide services without it, but again, you've got to show, because if that would ever come up in court and you can't show or prove that you tried to get consent, you'll be on the losing side of that lawsuit. If parents refuse services, the LEA will not be in violation of FAPE. I used to get calls like that all the time. Doctor saying the parent is refusing, and the student, the IEP team or the majority of the IEP team said that the student needed services, even though the parents did not want services. That does not mean that the student or the school is in violation of that free and appropriate public education. But it must be documented in that prior written notice. All right, referrals. So this is where North Carolina, South Carolina is they have it's a little bit different, but it's very similar. When we talk about referrals for special education, the first statement there is so important. When a public agency or a parent suspects that a child may have a disability, they must provide it in writing. So for schools, if a school suspects a disability, that writing is the data, the evidence, the MTSS worksheets or all the intervention documentation. That's the writing for the school, but for the parent, it must be a writing, meaning which has the reason for referral, addresses concerns and the child's current strengths and needs. That referral can be given to school administration, the teacher, any other school professional, the superintendent or an appointed official, or the person in charge of special education services. Here is what happens a lot when we talk about compliance is that a parent will write a referral note in a planner, or they'll write it on something that they think the teacher will see and the teacher doesn't see it, or the parent might come in and give the letter to your front office person. The front office person puts that in the principal's mailbox. There can be some patterns of miscommunication there. So it's important as an administrator, you have some very specific procedures and protocols in your building about what's to happen if you get a written referral for an evaluation. So specifically with your front office staff, or ensuring that teachers follow up with that as well. So again, the best practice there is that schools must act when there is a suspicion of a disability. And the most reliable suspicions of disability are driven by data. Again, that has gotten a lot of districts, especially in this post-COVID world where a lot of students came back below grade level. That's gotten a lot of districts in some hot water in terms of lawsuits. There's, guys, we live in a world where there's all these advocacy agencies who think that public education is we're the enemy, we're the adversary, and they are just going around looking for things that we don't necessarily know that we're doing wrong. There is a group in this state that is specifically targeting specific learning disabilities and the processes for that in this state. And what they are finding is that the courts are siding with this group, meaning that there are students who have for many years been below grade level, and that school has not acted upon it, and the courts are actually ruling in the favor of the groups of the advocacy group. So if there is a suspicion of a disability, schools must act. I've had the question, if there's a suspicion of disability and we didn't provide any intervention, what do? You still must act. We can get to the part of why you didn't provide intervention at another day, but if there is a suspicion of a disability, you must act upon it. So just keep that in mind. All right, so the initial evaluation. Each LEA must conduct a full and individual evaluation before special education or related services are given to the child. The IEP team must determine if the child has a disability. Evaluations must be conducted, eligibility determined, and an IEP developed and placement within 90 days of receipt of the written referral. So for those of you who are not in the EC world, you have 90 days, basically from the date that letter was given until you actually evaluate and determine if special education services are needed. We, as a district, where I was a district office or in the central office, we were not the best at our timelines. And so actually we went through a phase where we reduced that 90 days to 60 days for us so that we would have that 30-day buffer. So again, it depends on your district, but let's say a district does have some issues with compliance and meeting that 90-day timeline. There may be some different or some specific dates that you must meet. So again, that is out there. That's why I strongly encourage you to go and talk with your district to know those specific procedures and protocols. When conducting evaluations, the LEA must do the following: provide notice to parents that proposes to conduct an evaluation. You must use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant functional, developmental, and academic information. That's where your school psychologists are going to come into play, because they're going to be the ones who can interpret that data really well. But also with the new specific learning disability policy in North Carolina, you can't make the determination off of just that barrage of assessments on one day. It has to be data over time, multiple sources of data, multiple sources of classroom data, and multiple sources of data that show that the student is below grade level. So again, it is not the EC teacher's responsibility to provide that data. It is the general education teacher's responsibility to provide that data. And then school psychologists, if additional assessments are needed, school psychologists come in. Your district might have educational diagnosticians that come and support that actual test. Again, it depends, or administering those assessments, it depends on the district. But at the end of the day, this is where it's so important for school psychologists to help the IEP team interpret that data from those specific assessments. You see it there, and I should have bolded it and underlined it. You cannot use one single measure to determine a disability. You cannot. You must use multiple sources of data. And you must use sound instruments that assess relative contribution of cognitive and behavioral factors. Again, Kathleen, I feel like I'm talking about you a lot, but since you said you're a school psychologist, find a school psychologist as an administrator, develop a relationship with them, because they will become your best friend when you're doing IEP meetings, especially where there are evaluations. Okay. All right. So required screenings and evaluation for eligibility determination. So if I went through each of these, we would, like I said, we would be here, 4 or 5 days. I've listed them here. And you can see down there the best practice. LEA reps should always ensure all requirements have been met in any area being considered. So on pages 60 through 72, it has all 14 of the categories where students can be placed in North Carolina. And so, for example, let's just take let's take number 11, specific learning disability. There are probably 4 pages of things that should be taken into consideration when determining if a student has a specific learning disability. So as an administrator, if you go into an IEP meeting and you know that the categories being considered, one of them being specific learning disability, take that policies governing students with disabilities, review it so that you can keep up with the meeting and make sure that everything has went through the right process, and that you're actually complying with EC law. In your first couple of years, you're probably gonna have to do that every meeting. As you get better at this, as you start learning EC, and how to make sure that you're in compliance, it'll get better. But again, from the first year I was a school administrator until the last year that I was a school administrator, and even when I would attend IEP meetings as a central office employee, I always took that book with me. I always referred to that book. Even when I was 100% confident, I always turned to the page, and I always made sure, especially when I was in the central office, if I was in an IEP meeting, it was usually a pretty contentious meeting, but I would always be able to refer to that policy. It is hard for a parent to argue with a policy. They essentially can't. So just keep that in mind. I wish I had it. I'm out of town right now, but I wish I had my book. It has so many coffee stains on it. I've marked out things. There's sticky notes, because it truly, and when they just updated it a couple of years ago, I was really angry because I had all my notes in the old one. And then so now essentially I carry around both, because only really one part of it changed. So again, just if you learn anything from me rambling on tonight about EC, learn that you need to know that book. You need to print it out and have it with you. Okay, so reevaluations. The LEA must ensure a timely reevaluation for a child when there is improved academic achievement and functional performance. We forget about that one. We often forget about what happens when EC students improve, and they do. When I was in the central office, I did a study. We had a problem with caseloads. When you become an administrator, that's one of the biggest things that you're going to battle is the caseloads of EC teachers, especially in a world where we can't find EC teachers. So in my district, our teachers had really large caseloads. So we started doing kind of an informal study of where students were in 4th and 5th grade in EC classrooms. We found that a majority of those 4th and 5th grade students had made tremendous academic gains, but yet they were still in EC, having EC services the same amount of time that they did when they were originally placed in 1st and 2nd grade. That's a problem. So you've got to have a plan for looking at improved achievement and then reevaluating students when they have proven improved achievement or you have data to support that. If data suggests that evaluations are warranted, you can have a reevaluation. A lot of people interpret that 3-year evaluation rule as we only do reevaluations every 3 years. But if you have a student that starts making tremendous academic gains and they need to be exited from EC, then you call a reevaluation. If there's been a drastic change in educational performance for the worse, or they've regressed in skills and they made any additional time, you might need to call for a reevaluation. Again, you don't have to wait every 3 years. If it's warranted, you can have reevaluation certainly more than once in that 3-year period. They just shouldn't occur within the year. Again, in EC, there's always, I feel like, fine print under every sentence that we write, unless the parent and the LEA agree that a reevaluation within a year is necessary. Okay. But best practice there is EC teachers should manage schedules. LEA reps should oversee scheduling and routinely check for compliance. Not going to withhold the truth. I was awful at maintaining a schedule as an EC teacher. I was. And so the best assistant principal that I had was one who forced me to put it on a Google Doc or put it on, and then they always followed up to make sure that I was in compliance. And listen, in today's world where it's hard to find EC teachers, you're going to have to do everything possible to help them, because it's gotten to where it's almost an impossible job. So as an administrator, if you're responsible for LEAing IEP meetings, I would make sure that those IEP calendars that teachers have are shared with you. But it's also the LEA's responsibility to keep a list and help manage that as well. It's not just the EC teacher's responsibility. It's also the regular education teacher's responsibility. Those are the regular education teacher 90% of the time has that student the most. And again, going back to a mindset shift, really good administrators can help change that mindset in a building, that just because the student has an IEP does not make it just the EC teacher, does not make the student just the EC teacher's responsibility. All right. I did put a slide in here regarding MTSS and RTI and specific learning disabilities. Because this is relatively new. The new SLD policy came into place in 2020. Some districts had been implementing it previous to that, really starting in 2016, but now it is required. So determining a specific learning disability requires the use of a systematic problem-solving process based on the child's responsiveness to intervention, which is MTSS, or response to intervention, and evaluation of that data, which is progress monitoring. So schools, general education, is now responsible or has a much heavier presence in being part of that discussion about specific learning disabilities. It no longer is, we suspect a disability, we give it to the IEP team, the school psychologist comes in, does 1 day of testing, we determine if the student has a learning disability. It is a much more extensive process that requires the commitment of of regular education, general ed. So school-based MTSS procedures and protocols must be compliant with EC policy, which are interventions and progress monitoring. And at the end of the day, if they are not, the buck stops at the school's administration. It is not the EC teacher's responsibility to make sure that a student is receiving EC or intervention and progress monitoring in a regular education classroom, because the student is not EC yet. So the EC teacher should not be involved at all in that process. And there is a huge misconception between a lot of leaders across the state that anytime a kid is in intervention or progress monitoring and we think they're going to get to EC, that the EC teacher becomes involved. The only time the EC teacher becomes involved, or an IEP team becomes involved, is when there is an official suspicion of a disability by the MTSS team or by a parent or guardian, or anyone else that deals with the child on a regular basis. That's a learning curve for a lot of administrators, especially newer administrators, veteran administrators, who it was a completely different system. So just make sure that you're up to date on pages 73 through 75 there, so that you know what the expectations of what are they of general ed and what they are of special ed. All right. Again, just going back, so data must be collected from the regular education, I think I've already said this, about their academic performance, their response to intervention, their rate of improvement, evidence that primary factors have been ruled out. But again, the best practices there, school-based MTSS teams must be, or procedures must be compliant with EC policy, and do not use the discrepancy model. For those of you that don't know what the discrepancy model is, that's the old way that we typically identified specific learning disabilities, where basically the teacher suspected a disability, a parent suspected a disability, you have an IEP team meeting, you agree for an evaluation, a school psychologist or a diagnostician comes in, they administer a test over a series of 1 or 2 days, you determine if, and I'm summarizing this at a high level, you determine if there's a discrepancy between their achievement and their cognitive ability, and if there is more than 15 points, you can identify them with a specific learning disability. That is no longer the case, so just throw that out. And I put this in here because you don't know how many meetings that I was in where someone mentioned a discrepancy model. Or even though we looked at RTI, the educator or the teacher or somebody in the sim, well, they don't meet the discrepancy. So even though they're not performing with intervention, we're still not going to place them. Okay, so just completely remove discrepancy from your vocabulary when you're in an IEP meeting, and you'll be good to go.
Dr. Sane, would we summarize that to say, again, this may be again an oversimplification, but for those laymen of us in the group, Generally, in my era, that was the discrepancy between the IQ test score and the academic performance or grades.
Yeah.
But that okay, so that we don't, but yeah, we haven't used that in a long time and shouldn't have ever used it. But
Right.
so that's not it. So yeah, that's the old discrepancy model. Now parents will want to argue that is where I'm headed with this. And I had more arguments over that than any single issue in exceptional children. The years that I was involved with this was they wanted to argue the discrepancy model one way or the other. That was always the basis of their argument.
We
Yeah.
actually, cognitive assessments aren't required anymore for
Mhm.
specific learning disability unless there's a specific concern. So that kind of protects against that in some cases.
But I was when I was at New Hope, I had parents that went to the local psychologist. They had a pretty good side gig doing those assessments, and then the parents would bring them to the school. Yeah, that was the problem at New Hope. We stopped doing that, like you say, Kathleen. That's a great point. But that doesn't stop them from going to private people. Now, full disclosure, my niece is one of them private people. She makes a good living doing that, by the way. So yeah, they're gonna beat you with that stick, but you got to know the law that's not part of it. So they can bring in all the private scores from private psychologists that they want to, but that's not part of the process anymore. But that's a great point, Kathleen. That's exactly right. We don't even do that anymore. But that doesn't stop parents from doing it. I can tell you that.
And that just goes back to the importance of who is at the table. Who can be at the table to help interpret all of that outside data? Because it must be considered. You do consider it, but that doesn't mean you have. There is also this misconception that if a parent brings in outside testing, that we must follow what that testing says, and that is not the case. You interpret it, you put it on the table as a part of data, as a part of the data discussion, but that does not mean that whatever that outside person recommends, IEP teams do not have to follow that. Now, Dr. Lamb, I'm so glad you brought up parents, because what I saw is we know that administrators know that we don't have to follow what parents say. But in a world of an administrator where you have a lot of things going on, a lot of people don't want to have that battle. Okay.
Not the hill they want to die on.
Right. And I'm going to tell you this right now. This is a hill you want to die on. Because as soon as you start placing kids, because you want to avoid confrontation, you will have a school full of EC students. You will have a ton of lawsuits. It will be a mess. This is the IEP meetings. We hope that they're all happy and warm and fuzzy, and we do what's best for the kid, but they are not. They are confrontational, and it just seems like they get more and more confrontational by the year. But you have got to hold your ground, and like I said, it goes back to policy. No one can argue with policy. And as long as you're complying with that policy, then you're going to be good to go. But there are going to be some heavy conversations in the middle of that. So let's say 5 years from now you're a principal, and I think Dr. Lamb, you even referenced you being a principal in an LEA. So most commonly in this state, assistant principals are LEAs. But if you have assistant principal, when you're a principal one day that's weak in EC, you've got to support them. You've got to go in, you've got to model, or there are going to be IEP meetings where you want to attend as well. Because at the end of the day, who does the buck stop with? Not the AP, but the school leader. And what's not defensible in court is you saying as a principal, I assigned him or her to do EC meetings or IEP meetings and to do their job. So that's on him. It doesn't work that way. So again, just keep that in mind when you start growing, other leaders in your building. All right, the development of the IEP team. Quickly, the IEP team must consider the strengths of the child, any parent concerns, results of the initial or most recent evaluation that's been conducted. Again, going back to that interpretation of data, the needs of the child, or any special factors like, is English their second language, communication, behavior. Second, the regular education teacher of the child must participate in the development of the IEP and be a member of the IEP team. It is specifically written in policy that they must be there in all grades, kindergarten through 12th grade. And for those of you who are going into secondary, that is where we violate this the most. And I'm going to tell you specifically, and I love athletics. I love it. I love sports, but because a coach has a game does not exempt them from being at the IEP meeting. And if you know you have a kid, or if there's a student that has the coach is one of the primary teachers and you need them at the IEP meeting, then you're going to do what's in the best interest of the kid. And you're going to try and get that coach there. You're going to try and move around the meeting. But again, sometimes in education, we think that other duties exempt us from EC duties, and it does not. It absolutely does not. And so you've got to set that message as an administrator that your first priority is to be the teacher of children. A second or third priority may be to be the coach of children, but it is not your first. So again, don't let athletics or any other outside, any other secondary event get in the way of an IEP meeting. You must review and revise the IEP at least annually, and you must ensure that parents are informed throughout the process. Best practice there is that IEP teams should write the IEP. LEA reps should oversee compliance at the IEP meeting and beyond. Here's what I mean by IEP teams should write the IEP. Again, you probably know that I sound like a broken record. It is not the EC teacher's responsibility to write the full IEP. It's the IEP team's responsibility. So, the EC teacher will draft an IEP or will be the one that's writing it or being a part of it because they know sometimes the specific language, but it is not the the EC teacher's responsibility to write that full IEP. Just keep that in mind. I have been a part of several IEP meetings where the administrator actually reprimanded the EC teacher for there being parts of the IEP not being written. Well, technically, if you write an IEP before the IEP meeting happens, that's predetermination. So you can draft an IEP, you can have ideas to kind of save time, but you can't go in there and present an IEP as if it's already written before the IEP team has time to discuss it. So just keep that in mind as well. All right, so safeguards for parents and children. So this is where we get a lot of lawsuits in the world of EC and complying. So the LEA must establish, maintain, and implement safeguards for parents and students. Parents must be notified of those safeguards at least once a year, and that notice of procedural safeguards. I've linked that directly there because as an administrator, you probably should know those as well. Not probably, you should know those. And going back to my binder, I put it in a 3-ring binder, and all of those documents are in that one binder. To just make sure that you know that. Procedural safeguards must be available to parents, and those safeguards include independent evaluations, prior written notice, parental consent, access to records, due process, the availability of mediation if there's a contentious IEP meeting, child placement during due process, procedures for students who are subject to an alternate educational placement, civil actions, attorney fees. Again, that document goes through all of those. In the world of EC, we could spend, and I wish Dr. Lamb would give me 10 days to talk about EC, but he can't, we don't have time. But truly, this is 2 or 3 days in itself. So what I can do right now in this time is just please make sure that you know what safeguards can be provided, especially with due process, because you never want to tell a parent, no, we don't do that. No, you can't, you can't, we have the final say because you don't. There are processes and procedures in place for safeguarding the rights of children and parents. So just make sure that you always allow due process. Again, that's kind of the golden rule when you're talking about compliance. Always allow students and parents due process. So discipline procedures. School personnel may consider unique circumstances on a case-by-case basis when determining whether a change in placement is appropriate for a child with a disability who violates a code of conduct or the code of conduct. Dr. Lamb's already referenced this earlier tonight, but again, a child who is removed from their current placement must continue to receive educational services to ensure the child can make progress toward their IEP goals. And they must receive appropriate behavioral intervention services to address behaviors so they do not occur or that we can minimize their occurrence. But again, one of the things that we miss is, well, let me get to that in a second. I just want to, the best practice there is to always be proactive with addressing student behavior. That's just in general as an administrator, but specifically with functional behavior assessments or behavior intervention plans. Another best practice is to ensure educator compliance when implementing those plans. So if you have a student with a disability who has a behavior and you see that behavior is increasing or that it's becoming more prevalent, it should be the responsibility of the IEP team to call a meeting, a proactive meeting, I can't get my words out, to where you start addressing the behavior. It will help you in the long run, especially if the student's behavior continues to escalate. Then you've already got the functional behavior assessment completed. You've already got an intervention plan in place. You're already proving that you're trying to support the student, so that then it becomes a more fluid process when adding additional services with behavior. Here's what typically happens, and I hope that the EC teachers and psychologists on this call don't agree with me. I hope you already have good systems in place. But what typically happens is you have a student's behavior and it continues to escalate, and the general education side doesn't do anything about it. And then all of a sudden one day they call a meeting and say, we want this kid put in an alternative school, or we want them in a self-contained placement because of their behavior. There's not been a functional behavior assessment. There's not been a behavior intervention plan. And then you have kind of this debate between EC and regular ed on what we're going to do with this kid. And it gets pretty contentious. If general education works in tandem with EC regarding students who are already identified with a disability, but start having behaviors, that there can be a collective agreement in how we support that kid. But it is not EC's responsibility to manage functional behavior assessments or behavior intervention plans in isolation. There's also a misconception in the world of public ed that an FBA or a BIP is conducted only by EC. That is not true. It has to be implemented throughout the entire school day. Okay, and that right there at the end, the best practice is ensuring educator compliance when implementing behavior plans. We so often write behavior plans, and then general ed they don't do those behavior plans. So again, it's got to be a relationship between both, especially when we're talking about discipline procedures. Here's the most dreaded word for an EC teacher or a school psychologist or anybody involved, an administrator, is that manifestation determination, primarily because of the paperwork that's involved. But this can, if we don't comply with them, they can really turn into a lot of headaches for schools. And if you don't follow these procedures, like I said, typically schools are on the losing end of this. But within 10 days of a change in placement, the IEP team must determine two things. Was the conduct caused by the child's disability, or was the conduct in question a direct result of the LEA's failure to implement the IEP? So the conduct must be determined to be a manifestation of the child's disability if the IEP team determined either condition was met. But Dr. Lamb, you probably do a better job at explaining this. Talk to the class a little bit about what that 10 days means and where some of the mistakes that we sometimes make as administrators with that 10 days specifically.
Well, again, we're trying to avoid that paperwork. And so again, we don't follow the rules of button seat. If you change, in school, out of school, detention doesn't matter. If they're not in the same seat, that starts the clock. And then the second mistake we make is thinking, well, although the code of conduct says we should give him, 3 days of this or 4 days of that, we're going to give him one so we have up to 10 times he can misbehave 10 times. Well, then you got to go on if they're showing a pattern. So the third time the kid does the same thing, you go in front of the line. We start the manifestation determination. Now, again, we can't wait till he does it 10 times. If he does the same thing the third time, then doesn't matter that you've only suspended him 2 days or 3. And then the notion here is, was the conduct in question direct result of the LEA's failure to implement the IEP? That's one that we ignore that one. We say, yeah, this didn't have anything to do with his disability, and we try to rush him through. But if we didn't implement the BEP or the behavior intervention plan, if we haven't done any interventions with this kid other than just suspended, that's when we get in trouble as well. But 90% of the time that I had to go to court and CMS when I was in charge of this is because we were trying our best to avoid the paperwork of a manifestation determination. And we were trying to get these kids dumped off in alternative placements, and we were doing everything but what we needed to do. That's your problem. You got to do it, and you got to call yourself out. If a kid's got a behavior intervention plan, and you've not been keeping up with it, and that's part of his IEP, then that's on you, not on him. And that's a biggie as well. So violating the days. And his next slide is going to talk about this. Violating the days, number one, is where you get in trouble. You didn't count all the days, and you should have counted when you changed his, where he's actually set that day. And number two, you let a pattern develop. And number three, you had a behavior intervention plan, and you thought that the only people that had to worry about that was the EC crowd. Now, I've got a slideshow in there, I'm not going to go, that talks about the difference between mainstreaming and inclusion. Mainstreaming is when a kid goes to some classes in EC and goes to some regular ed. Inclusion is he goes regular ed. Well, who do you think in that case like that, in either of those cases, why would you think that the regular ed people wouldn't have to be involved in that behavior intervention plan? Because he's in regular classes at least part of the day in mainstreaming and all the day in an inclusion model. That's when you get yourself in trouble right there.
Okay. Yep. One of the last things that I dealt with before I took this new job was we had a student who physically harmed a teacher just in passing. And there was a pattern of kind of aggressive behavior that was continuing to increase. And to Dr. Lamb's point, because the school was so hesitant to do a manifestation, they just suspended the student for a short amount of time to make the 10 days last. Well, the teacher, rightfully so, needed medical attention and sued for medical support. Well, who do you think won that case? The teacher did, because we did not put those specific procedural safeguards in place for that student. So a lot of people view manifestations as a pain in the rear. They are, but they are imperative to school safety. And as an administrator, when remember, we're not looking at this through the view of an EC teacher. We're truly looking at through the view of school safety. Because when you get students who require manifestation determinations, a lot of times there are safety risks at play. And if we don't follow through with them, oftentimes people get hurt. And that is not a place you want to be as a school leader, just because you don't want to do the paperwork. And I think about if I were still an EC teacher and I heard that, I would be very offended by that. But remember, I'm not talking as an EC teacher. I'm talking as a school leader. We've got to make sure that our ducks are in the row. But a reason that most EC teachers hate manifestation determinations is because they've been the ones that have primarily had to do all the work. And that, like Dr. Lamb said, it's not their primary responsibility. It's a collective approach.
to your point, the kid that the young kid that shot the teacher recently, um, was a failure to act on the part of the school. The kid had been referred. The kid had multiple incidents, and they were trying to avoid having to do a manifestation on the kid, and he ended up shooting the teacher. Yeah, that's the kind of, you won't get over that, folks. I'm gonna tell you right now, that's the end of your career. That's, you got to find something else to do. Uh, yeah, that one, where was that, in Maryland, somewhere along the eastern seaboard within the last 2 months? I think it was in Newport News, in Virginia. There, I believe that's where it was, in Newport News. The kid brought a gun and shot the teacher, but that wasn't his first time. But they had been avoiding doing a manifestation of termination because they didn't want to do the paperwork. Well, tell that to the teacher that got shot.
Yep. So just again, next slide on this, because it is so important. If the IEP team determines the conduct was a manifestation, the following must occur. You must conduct an FBA and implement a BIP. If a FBA or a BIP has already been created and implemented, you must modify it to address the behavior. You return the child to their original placement unless the IEP team agrees to a change in placement or due to special circumstances. And again, you can go into more detail on page 98 there. So just keep those in mind when we're talking about manifestation. So I know that you guys have heard me ramble tonight, and I hope that it was not too boring. And even if it was boring, just know that it is so critical to follow EC law. It is, well, any law, but this is where you'll have the most headaches, but it's also where you can have the least headaches if you stay ahead of the ballgame, if you ensure compliance. And the easiest way to do that is always refer to the policies governing services for children with disabilities. You got the link to it. If you don't already have it, know your district's specific interpretations of EC policy and all of the subsequent procedures and protocols. Become really good friends with your EC director or somebody up there in that EC department at the district. Keep in regular communication. One day when you become a principal, each district typically has an LEA meeting at the district level where the EC director or the EC department brings in LEAs to keep them updated with latest policies and procedures. If you're a principal and you've got other people that you're sending to that meeting, have a meeting to discuss or debrief that meeting. Okay, you always, as the principal, want to stay in the know as well. When you're unsure, ask questions, be proactive, and be prepared. Big thing here. Tried to emphasize it with the all caps. If there are concerns in an IEP meeting and you are unsure how to proceed as the LEA, stop the meeting. Okay. Remember, stopping the meeting and violating a timeline, if stopping the meeting is going to save your district millions of dollars, stop the meeting. Make every effort or attempt to keep parents involved, even though there's some parts of that policy that gives you kind of the green light to proceed when they're not involved or they're not informed. Make every effort to do so. If you cannot prove you made an effort, you'll always lose in the court of law. Each child's disability is unique. Don't expect a playbook of how to support the student. We didn't really talk about this, but I've been in several IEP meetings where there's been a lot of copy and pasting to the extent where we actually used other students' names because we forgot to go back and delete that name out. Do not do that. And as an LEA, you've got to help and support your teachers because a lot of times if they're copy and pasting it, it means they're overwhelmed, they're overloaded. So we've got to do something to advocate for their caseloads. But again, just make sure that doesn't happen. And I know I said I'll stop talking, but here's why. If a parent is sitting in an IEP meeting and you've got the IEP projected on the screen and you read another kid's name, that puts doubt in the parent's head. Well, they don't know my kid. They're copy and pasting. And when doubt comes in, so do lawsuits. I always said that. If a parent doubts what we're doing in public education, that's where they get advocates. And that's where your job becomes more complicated. So just those little things can make a huge difference. And then always maintain confidentiality with any student who has an IEP in general. Any student in general, maintain confidentiality. So again, I hope that was not too much, and I know it's not the most interesting things, but hopefully you'll get something out of it, and you can use this information as you become an EC leader in your buildings or an LEA once you get those administrative jobs.
Great job. Y'all just got several $1,000s worth. He charges a lot of money for this. Y'all got it for, well, for whatever. You don't get it for free because Gardner Webb charges you. As I said, I'm gonna close it up right quickly here. I'm gonna do some of this under week 3, or Zoom session 3, excuse me. His presentation, this is the one he did last semester. He's got the updated one. He'll send it to me, but it's virtually the same. This has the page references. I've got a folder here that's got some forms in it that a couple of sitting principals that we work with have graciously given us access to. Parent resources. If you don't know the difference in inclusion and mainstreaming, that's a very long, take you about 15 minutes, but it's very long, but you know, you don't have to read it word for word. Got a PowerPoint, and again, it's not near as good as Dr. Sain's because it's mine, but it explains the difference in those. And you need to know the difference when you go to a school. You need to know what type of program that you offer. The intervention process, I've got just a general one here. And then lastly, I have FERPA. And that's the last thing I want to talk about tonight, very briefly. Dr. Sain has a story about 2 teachers talking about an EC kid, and a third one overheard and told the parent, not good. My story is I was in a public separate school, all EC kids, and the door was open to the lounge into the lobby of the office public, and they were discussing kids. Something that simple will get you fired. Will get you in a lawsuit. There's no excuse for that stuff, and that's kind of that's as we exit tonight. You can probably hear, you know, this is the benediction. You know, just as I am is playing in the background here. But if nothing else, make sure that what's confidential stays confidential. That's low hanging fruit, folks, and that one gets you every time. You just got to pay attention to that. When I respond back to your post and discussion board about EC and intervention, I remind you, my big reminder as we go out the door tonight, this is the collaborative process. All the work may be on you as school people, but it's still collaborative with the parents. And like Dr. Sain said, you don't come in with an IEP already written and just try to run over top of them. Don't copy and paste and have somebody else's name on it. That will not go. If you treat it as the collaborative process that it is, things will go a lot better for you. If you try to say, we're going to do what we're going to do and what works best and what is easiest for me and the faculty here, it will go really badly for you. Thank you for being with us tonight. Again, Dr. Sain, excellent job. I mean, folks, this is the real deal here. I mean, this is a perfect primer for EC. You should keep this. I would download this and put this somewhere. So when you get your job, you know, you can refer back to this, because this is one of them dirty jobs like bus duty you're going to have to do when you're in the new AP. That's just the way. We'll see you next week for your case study presentations. I don't know that I'll sleep between now and then. I'm so excited about those. You're doing great, all of you. I could call all of you. I should have recognized all of you as stars of the week. You're doing a great job, and I appreciate it. Your work is great. I enjoy reading it, all of it. There's no but or caveat coming. I'm having a great time. I hope you are. Thank you for being with us tonight. Dr. Sain, again, thank you. We'll see you all next week.
Good night.
Night.